Okay, we can start.
All right, good morning, everyone. And I have the pleasure to welcome you to our new conversations today. We have as our guest Professor Geir Sigurðsson from the University of Iceland. He's Professor of Chinese Studies and Philosophy and head of the program of Chinese Studies. He earned his PhD from the University of Hawaii in Manoa in 2004 with a dissertation about Li rituals in Confucianism. And he is an expert on Chinese, Asian philosophy, intercultural philosophy, and philosophy of education. He has a wide selection of publications, and he has published in English, in Chinese, in Icelandic. You can find all his publications on his website. I will just limit myself to cite a few main publications today. Among which his book on Confucian propriety and ritual learning, a philosophical interpretation from 2015. And he has also recently published a co-edited volume on language and history of ideas. And he has last year, I think, his commented translation of the Sunzi, The Art of War, has been published in Icelandic. And this will also reconnect with the topic of his today's talk. And I will also quote a couple of articles related to a very actual topic, which is how Confucianism can contribute to education. We have transformative critique, what Confucianism can contribute to contemporary education, which is published in Studies of Philosophy and Education, and Li, Ritual and Pedagogy, a cross-cultural exploration. And it also has very interesting contributions to edited volumes, such as, for instance, Anthropocosmic Processes in the Anthropocene, Revisiting Quantum Mechanics versus Chinese Cosmology Comparison, in a co-edited volume by Arun Bala and Prasenjit Duara. And I will also cite his most recent contribution, Confucian Philosophy as a Universal Account of Civilized Living, a Contemporary Interpretation, in a co-edited volume by Russell Manning and Sarah Flavel. So I don't want to steal too much time, also to allot enough time for discussion in the end. So we'll just introduce the title of his talk today, and then we'll leave the floor to Geir. So the title of the talk today is Anonymous Leaders and Easy Victories, Daoist Traces in Sunzi's Art of Warfare. So thank you very much, Geir, for being with us today, for giving this talk, and I leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Lisa, for this kind introduction, and of course for the invitation to participate in this conversation, which I hope is going to be enjoyable and relaxed. I will share my screen, and let's hope everything works out. Is it being shared?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, good. And you can hear me well? So
yes.
I don't need to speak loudly or louder? It's okay?
All is good.
Okay, good. Okay, so yeah, so thanks again. Maybe first of all, why did I choose this topic? Like Lisa mentioned, of course, that I had produced a translation of the Sunzi, and when I was working on that translation, I got really quite fascinated by some related ideas that I felt were shared in the Tao Te Ching, and so here is my translation. Came out in 2019. Actually came in 20, but it's listed in 19. And as Lisa said, of course, it's not very useful for anyone here because it's translated into Icelandic, which almost nobody speaks. It's not very difficult to learn Icelandic, but then again, it doesn't make any sense to learn Icelandic. So I wouldn't recommend it necessarily. But I had a lot of fun when I was working with this, and it actually turned out to be much more difficult than I expected. I have to say, the text is much more philosophical than I thought. And then after I had produced this translation, I was teaching this course on the Tao Te Ching, and we were actually comparing the 5 existing Icelandic translations of the Tao Te Ching. I think the Tao Te Ching is probably the book that has been translated most often into Icelandic, probably more than the Bible even, even though it's much more difficult to translate the Tao Te Ching than the Bible. And that was actually a very, very interesting experiment. We were, of course, we were comparing the translations, of course, but we were also trying to understand the text. And I felt that simply comparing these different interpretations was actually very useful for gaining a perspective on the text. So, and while I was teaching that course, I mean, this was supposed to be a course where we would sit down together in a nice classroom and read these texts in a way together, because when you have many translations, you actually have many texts. But of course, then we had COVID, so we had to do it all online, actually through Teams, like we are doing today. And that wasn't maybe the ideal situation, but it did work out fairly well. And I learned a lot from that course. And since Sunzi was sort of still fresh in my mind, I really enjoyed seeing traces of the Tao Te Ching in his thinking, but also traces of the Tao Te Ching in the Sunzi. I will come back to this. So I thought today that we would actually be comparing texts in a way. We will be comparing. It will be a comparative philosophy, but only dealing with China, of course, apart from the translations that we will be looking into. So it's a kind of an internally comparative exercise, and maybe there's nothing. It's not going to be anything groundbreaking here for you, but maybe it will be a kind of a reminder of how interesting it is to read these texts and also think about the interconnections between the texts that we find in the Warring State period, and I feel that grasping the interconnections between them can enable us to gain simply a better understanding of both texts. So I hope I will just be speaking for about 40 minutes or so, and then I will be really happy to have comments and severe criticisms, hopefully, and of course just a good conversation. I just want to point out that a couple of sources that I was using in preparing this talk, and I actually came across these English sources just recently. A very recent paper by Thomas Michael, which is quite a nice paper that I would recommend. Strategic Sages and Cosmic Generals: A Daoist Perspective of the Intertextuality of the Tao Te Ching and the Sunzi, which was published in Tao last year. And then a slightly older paper by Sandra Wawrytko, Winning Ways: The Viability and Virtuosity of Sunzi's Methods of Warfare, published in Journal of Chinese Philosophy 2007. Quite good papers, but also I was using an annotated Chinese, modern Chinese translation of the Sunzi Bingfai when I was working on my own translation by Sunzi, of whom I don't really know anything, but I actually found it to be a very, very nice annotated translation with many good ideas. And then, of course, Li Ling is a big authority on Sunzi, and I was using this Bing Yi Jia Wo Du Sunzi by Li Ling, which is a lovely book, very accessible, I would say. Now, in a way, my title may be a little bit misleading, because I call it, what did I call it? I can't even remember what I call it. Daoist Traces in Sunzi's Art of Warfare. Now, it's quite difficult, if not impossible, to ascertain something about influences. And the title seems to indicate that that Sunzi is a kind of a work influenced by Taoism. But it's not so easy to say who is taken from whom here. The late Chinese scholar He Bingdi claimed that the Tao Te Ching is in fact expanding upon Sunzi. And he even goes so far as to say that the Sunzi is the forefather of the Tao Te Ching. Now, unfortunately, I only saw these references to He Bingdi in Thomas Michael's paper here. And I wasn't able to access He's writings. Though from what I can tell, he seems pretty persuasive, although of course it's a debated issue. I'm going to return later to He these insights, but I think for now it's just important that we take note of the fact that it's not necessarily the case that Sunzi is influenced by Taoism than the other way around. And I would also like to point out a few other commonalities of the two texts. Now, one is, of course, that these are both oral texts. They are possibly emerged around similar time. I was speaking about possibly late 4th century BCE. And they are both, of course, quite obviously responding to the dire situation during the Warring States period. We have also found different versions of both texts in the archaeological digs. So there were obviously different variations of them, slightly different variations circulating. It has also been well, most scholars agree that both of these texts have several authors. The Lao Tzu was almost certainly didn't exist as a single author of the Tao Te Ching, and it's not certain that Sun Wu is the sole author of the Sunzi Bingfa. Now, then again, of course, if we refer to the content of the books, then or the texts, they are both similar in that they actually have a very wide scope of application or interpretation. Most people would say that Tao Te Ching is focusing on rulership, although some claim that it's about yang sheng or taking care of one's body or some kind of cultivation. The Sunzi Bingfa obviously is a book of manual of warfare, but both of them can be interpreted in a much wider fashion, and it has been done and is still being done. In fact, simply because of the philosophical content of the books or the texts that actually refer very much to our surroundings and how we should interact with our surroundings, including, of course, people. So therefore, both texts can actually be applied in many different ways. And now coming back to this topic of the influences, because it's generally been taken as given that Taoism influenced Sunzi, and I mean, I did that myself in my title, but there is really nothing saying that it couldn't be the other way around. In the record of the Grand Historian, the Shiji, Sima Tian doesn't mention the military school as such, but there is a quite well-known and quite terrifying also account of Sun Wu as the author of Bingfa, while he is giving King He Lu of Wu a sample of how to discipline troops by having two of the king's favorite concubines executed when they didn't take his command seriously enough. There is also much reference to Bingfa in the Shiji, the method of warfare, or as we have become used to speak of it in the West, which is most probably influenced by Machiavelli, to speak of it as the art of war. Machiavelli produced his book in 16th century, Dell'arte della guerra. And then, of course, we have the first translation of the Sunzi Bingfa by Jean-Joseph Marie Amiot, which was in the 18th century, 1772, was sorry about my French translation. Les 13 articles sur l'art des militaires par Sunzi. So Amiot in the first Western translation, he calls it the art of war. Hanshu, history of the former Han, compiled a little later than the Shuti, or in the 1st century AD, speaks of the school of militarism, the Bingjia, so not just the Bingfa, but the Bingjia. And it's of course possible that the Bingjia was not a unitary school of thought, but rather a designation of the various Bingfa, various methods of war. But it's still stated in the Hanshu that the Bingjia valued not waging wars, which seems to indicate that it was, after all, something of a unitary purpose. This is what it says in my very, very poorly formulated translation. I'm sorry. In the 6th classics view of proper governing, the emphasis is on the avoidance of disorder, of one. In the military school's view of a proper victory, the emphasis is on the avoidance of battle. And we will come back to this when we look at the text a little bit. Roger Ames, in his very celebrated translation of the Sunzi Bingfa, notes that in the Hanshu, and he is actually, I think, referring to this place, around this place, there is actually a list of writings, both Daoist and military writings. And he says that the military writings are listed under the Daoist school, which is also an assumption of Daoism or Daoist philosophy being somehow prior to the military, which doesn't really have to be the case at all. It doesn't have to be a Daoist influence, even though they are associated together. So maybe Roger is going a little bit too far in this assumption. Yes, let me see. So what I want to do here is to discuss a few commonalities that we find in the texts of the Sunzi Bingfa and the Tao Te Ching. To some extent, we can find traces of other schools of thought in the Sunzi Bingfa. We can find some Ru influences. There are some references to Ru notions, such as Ren and Sin, but I will not discuss that specifically, but I think it shows that the situation out of which Chinese schools came into existence at the time produced what we could perhaps call a shared problematic that they all had in common, namely to find the path to peace and stability. And of course, it shows something else that I think we all know quite well. The very syncretic nature of the philosophical schools of thought in ancient China. And it perhaps reminds us that we must be careful in not constructing too rigid boundaries between them. But let me now move to the intertextualities. Similar ideas. I will mostly be focusing on ideas, not so much on texts or similarity in texts. I'm not really a sinologist. I'm a philosopher, so I prefer working with ideas than with specific formulations. But I will, in the end, if we have time, I will point at some places that are considered to be very similar by some authors. Okay, so the first idea that we find and is very similar in both texts is the anti-war stance. Now, this is not always admitted in the case of the Sunzi. I find that very surprising. And some interpreters understand the text as providing a military solution to the warring state situation. And of course, it's true that there are sections providing advice about, for instance, how to get as much as possible out of the soldiers. But this has to do with the situation after battles have begun. And there is no doubt, at least not in my mind, that Sunzi really accentuates strategic approaches that are meant to prevent direct battle. And I think this comes through very clearly in chapter 3. I'm actually using, just to simplify things, I'm using the translation by Roger Ames, since it's a very popular translation of the Sunzi, and then I will be using D.C. Lau's translation of the Tao Te Ching, which is also very popular, and I think a lot of people know about it. We can, of course, talk about translation later, but I will not be discussing the translations as such, or at least not very much. So in chapter 3, we have these two passages. So to win 100 victories in 100 battles is not the highest excellence. The highest excellence is to subdue the enemy's army without fighting at all. And then a little bit later, therefore, the expert in using the military subdues the enemy's forces without going to battle, takes the enemy's walled cities without launching an attack, and crushes the enemy state without a protracted war. So it's quite obvious that the preference is to win the battle without waging the war, at least not a bloody war. And we can find something very similar in the Tao Te Ching. Probably the clearest example is in section 31. Arms are instruments of ill omen, or maybe I don't need to read all this. There is no glory in victory, and to glorify it despite this is to exalt in the killing of man. One who exalts in the killing of man will never have his way in the empire. So it's here the point is that war is a sorrowful event that we should not be glorifying. It's a sad affair. Should always be the last resort when all other possibilities are exhausted. So even when one is victorious, like is described here, there is bloodshed, there is death, there is misery. So when victorious in war, one should observe the rites of mourning. Similarly, in Sunzi, I'm going back here. So as it says in the very beginning of chapter 3, it's best. It's not cited here. I'm sorry. It's best to keep one's own state intact. To crush the enemy state is only a second best. It's best to keep one's own army, battalion, company, or 5-man squad intact. To crush the enemy's army, battalion, company, or 5-man squad is only a second best. And this is, of course, Bingjufa, the true art or the method of warfare to minimize damage to the greatest extent possible. Oh, sorry, here it is. I had lost this. So, so this is definitely one aspect that they have in common. And there are other sections in the Tao Te Ching discussing warfare, but I will move to another one now. So I think one of the strengths of the Tao Te Ching, what makes this text so relevant even today to our contemporary times, is that it's a very persuasive critique of many of the superficial values that cause so many social ills, but are possibly even more widespread today than ever, of power, wealth, and fame. And I think the Tao Te Ching argues really convincingly how damaging these values can be when we follow these values blindly. And there are many wonderful passages about the pitfalls of greed and hunger for power. But I want to focus in particular on fame, because it really mirrors a view expressed in the Sunzi Bingfa. Now here is a sample of a few of the many passages in the Tao Te Ching where the quest for fame and prestige is really downplayed as quite risky business, in many cases for one's person, for oneself, but also for the task at hand. It's in fact an indication or a symptom that something has gone seriously wrong. So in that sense, the distinction between famous and being infamous is quite blurred. Now, I'm going to spare you from reading this through, but just focus on one of these, which has in particular, I think, a bearing on our topic or my title. The best of all rulers is but a shadowy presence to his subjects. Let's compare it with this one from the Sunzi Bingfa here in chapter 4. To win in battle so that the whole world says excellent is not the highest excellence. Hence, to lift an autumn hair is no mark of strength. To see the sun and moon is no mark of clear sightedness. To hear a thunderclap is no mark of keen hearing. He whom the ancients called an expert in battle gained victory where victory was easily gained. Thus, the battle of the expert is never an exceptional victory, nor does it win him reputation for wisdom or credit for courage. So it's actually the last bit here that I think is important. So the experts in battle are most probably rather unknown personalities. They have managed to steer clear of terrifying wars, which have therefore not been fought, and no one really knows what they have achieved. It's a kind of a preventive achievement, and a preventive achievement is always curious in the sense that it's impossible to know what exactly has been prevented, what would have happened if it hadn't been prevented. And it's really very difficult to gain a reputation for something that is unknown. And it's just like the unknown excellent leaders in the Tao Te Ching who manage affairs without anybody noticing, so that they are just a shadowy presence, or as we could also maybe put it, we really just faintly know of their presence, and we don't always need to have them in our faces, for instance, on television. So maybe when we see too much of our leaders, that's an indication of a problem, or that things are not going quite right. In both cases, there is a certain wu-wei approach to things, that things should be managed with when it requires as little effort as possible. And then there is another common element that I take particular interest in, and that's the predilection for preventive measures. As it said in the Han Shu that I quoted earlier, the Liu Jing consider proper governing to be the prevention of chaos or disorder. The military school considers proper victory to be one where battle is prevented. A victory won with bloodshed and lots of sacrifices is not the best victory. And this really prompts me to mention the story of the doctor. It's a well-known story. Many of you probably know it. Bian Che from the He Guanzi. The He Guanzi is also from a text from the Warring States period. containing both Daoist and military elements, along with Mingjia and others. So it actually fits rather well. You probably know the story, but just in case you don't, Bianchir is really a very famous doctor, renowned all through the empire for his abilities, and he becomes the king's personal doctor, of course. And then they have a conversation one day, the king and Bianchir says that in fact he has two brothers, and both of his brothers are actually much better doctors than he is. And the king just doubts his words. I mean, how is that possible? You are the best doctor that we could think of. And then Bianchir explains, and he says, sort of a loose translation, my first brother detects illnesses when they are still inchoate, have not yet taken shape, and eliminates them. Therefore, he is not known outside of the family. My second brother deals with illnesses when they reveal themselves in the smallest hairs of the body. Therefore, he is not known outside of the hamlet. I, Bianchir, on the other hand, pierce veins, apply numerous medicines, cut through skin and muscles, but because of this inadequacy of mine, I have become known even beyond the kingdom. So Bianchir is actually famous because he is less adept at dealing with illnesses, while his brothers are unknown precisely because of their superior skills. And in a similar manner, the most efficient ruler in the Tao Te Ching is one who does what she does without anybody noticing. When she really excels in her performance, she manages to prevent difficulties before they even develop, and no one ever knows that they could have arisen. And this is a case of a Wu-Wei approach to things. We have, of course, this well-known passage or chapter in the Tao Te Ching, which says it's easy to maintain a situation while it is still secure. It is easy to deal with a situation before symptoms develop. It is easy to break a thing when it is yet brittle. It is easy to dissolve a thing when it is yet minute. Deal with a thing while it is still nothing. Keep a thing in order before disorder sets in. Just note that wording in the end, keep a thing in order before disorder sets in. 治愈伪乱. Incidentally, quite similar to the one in the Han Shu, 幽静止治归于伪乱. Okay, now time is moving. I want to move to another quite interesting resonance, and these has to do with the references to the notions of Qi and Zheng, or Qi and Zheng. It varies. Different opinions on whether Qi should be Qi or not. And this is among the more important features of the Sunzi Bingfa. It's the idea of applying, depending on circumstances, what is called, or sometimes called, indirect or direct methods. And these have different translations. Ames speaks of surprise and straightforward. I actually prefer indirect and direct. Harro von Senger, who is a very interesting German translator of the Sunzi Bingfa, uses außergewöhnlich and gewöhnlich, which is something like extraordinary and ordinary. I don't think the exact translation is very important here. I think the meaning comes through relatively clearly. But in the following, I will just be using the original Chinese words instead of English translations. Here you have it. Actually, Li Ling claims that this character should be pronounced in this case Qi, but I'm not a sinologist. I don't really know. I think they actually this pair constitutes one of the more fascinating idea in the Sunzi Bingfa. That is to say, of course, Shi, which is even more difficult to translate. Ames calls it strategic advantage, but he also notes that depending on circumstances, sjö can mean aspect, situation, disposition, configuration, force, influence, momentum, and more. Harro von Senger speaks of siegbegünstigende Kräftekonstellationen. That's a wonderful word. Something like constellations of energies conducive to victory. And then there you have more simple renderings like Volker Klöpsch. He uses Schlagkraft, and the early translation by Lionel Giles, he uses very simply energy. I prefer actually referring to sjö more proactively as harnessing the dominant circumstances. And this is more or less how I translate it into Icelandic. I wish I could tell you that it sounds smoother in Icelandic, because it doesn't. Anyway, some of you, probably all of you know François Julien's debated book based on this tricky character, Propension des choses, or Propensity of Things in English. And it's a debated book. And whatever can be said of the book, it's no doubt that it's a highly, sjö is a highly versatile notion, referring to the influences of the environment on our actions and how they can be put to use. Okay, so this is sorry, I didn't write what. This is chapter 5 in Sunzi 5. I forgot to write that. The chapter 5 is on sjö. So it says, for gaining sjö in battle, there are no more than ji and jung operations, yet in combination they produce inexhaustible possibilities. Ji and jung operations give rise to each other endlessly, just as a ring is without a beginning or an end. And who can exhaust their possibilities? So ji and jung are sort of strategic approaches that we shift between depending on the status of sjö in the environment, which of course also applies to the enemy. And the Tao Te Ching also explicitly uses these terms to recommend different strategies for governing and waging wars. That's what we have in chapter 57. So the Jung will be for government, the Ji will be for warfare. But in 58, they are associated with the constant changes in the environment, so oscillating between yin and yang. So we always have to align ourselves with the circumstances as they are. I mean, that really would be in line with how we understand sjö. In fact, sjö really has to do with the situation at hand and how we adapt to it. I mean, I would say, for instance, that giving a talk in a if I had you in front of me in a classroom, that would be a very different sjö, I think, from what we have here. Now, Höping D argued that the Tao Te Ching took this distinction from the Sunzi and applied it to the yin-yang cosmology, or the yin-yang Taoology, as I prefer calling it, according to which mutual configuration of things is constantly changing in an incessant process. And this is, of course, all over the place in the Tao Te Ching, but we also find it in the Sunzi Bingfa, both in dealings with the natural environment and the enemy. And here's just a couple of examples in the Sunzi Bingfa. Let's see. Yeah, chapter 6, which is called Full and Empty Aims, actually says strong points and weak points. It concludes by noting that the army must be mobile and adaptive to the changing situations. And then we have a short lesson in Taoology. Thus, of the 5 phases, none is the constant victor. Of the 4 seasons, none occupies a constant position. The days are both short and long. The moon waxes and wanes. And then it says, thus, an army does not have fixed strategic advantages or an invariable position to be able to take the victory by varying one's position according to the enemies is called being inscrutable. And then we have that nice sentence. Sorry, I got a bit confused here. And then it offers a lot of strategic advice, taking heed of the continuous changes and propensities. From chapter 7, an entire enemy army can be demoralized and its commander can be made to lose heart. Now, in the morning of the war, the enemy's morale is high. By noon, it begins to flag. By evening, it has drained away. So the expert in using the military avoids the enemy when his morale is high and strikes when his morale is flagged and is drained away. So it's really all about right timing, which is, of course, also a very common topic in the Tao Te Ching. It's also, and I think this is beyond any doubt, it's often pointed out that the Tao Te Ching has a preference for yin actions. Wei, of course, softness, easiness, prevention, in fact, I think is a kind of a yin action. And I think the same can be said about the Sunzi Bingfa. The softer, the more strategic approaches, the G approaches, are preferred to the straightforward ones based on sheer strength, unless when the strength is there. But then there is a kind of a preference for revealing the might instead of using it, which of course can be a form of bullying, perhaps, but it may have the advantage of preventing battle and bloodshed. Okay, so I'm sort of approaching the end now, but if I have still time, then I would like to say a few more things. There are more similarities between the text, and some perhaps appear rather minor, but I think when we consider them as parts of a whole, we will find that the messages, that the tones, perhaps the atmospheres in the text do resonate considerably. There is, for instance, an emphasis on calmness, not to make important decisions when we are enraged or upset, in particular, of course, associated with warfare and military decisions. So in the Sunzi Bingfa, and if your commander unable to control his temper sends your troops swarming at the walls, your casualties will be 1 in 3, and still you will not have taken the city. And then you have also from 12th, that I will not read, but it's a kind of a similar exhortation, reminder. And Tao Te Ching 68, one who excels in fighting is never roused in anger. It's very important to keep calm, and well, it sounds very British somehow. Keep calm and fight. Also emphasized in both writings is a reminder of the importance of understanding one's own situation. Now, Tao Te Ching is of course about the everyday, about what is right there in front of us, but we often don't pay attention to it. But we shouldn't forget, really, we shouldn't forget these aspects of reality. And this applies to some extent, I think, to ourselves. And this is what I have called, in fact, in the paper that Lisa referred to, a transformative self-critical view. I think it's very, very strong in Confucianism, but we can also find it in Daoist or in a militarist fashion, for sure. When we are focusing on tasks, we often forget to take account of our own position, our own ability, our own bias, perhaps. So when we assess circumstances that we find ourselves in and we have to deal with, we mustn't forget that we are also an integral part of these circumstances. So understanding oneself is really of prime importance. In the Tao Te Ching, it says, he who knows others is clever, he who knows himself has discernment, he who overcomes others has force, he who overcomes himself is strong. And in the Sunzi Bingfa, there are two similar places at the end of 3. He who knows the enemy and himself will never in 100 battles be at risk. He who does not know the enemy but knows himself will sometimes win and sometimes lose. He who knows neither the enemy nor himself will be at risk in every battle. Excuse me. And at the end of 10, know the other, know yourself, and the victory will not be a risk. And then perhaps there's finally some textual and stylistic resonances that I can maybe not comment too much on between Dao De Jing and the Sunzi Bingfa, suggested by Sunzi, the commentator of the Sunzi Bingfa that I used in my own translation. Very poetic and beautiful descriptions of the subtlety of both the expert in battle in the Sunzi Bingfa and Dao, and of course the leader in the Dao De Jing. So also the superb ruler. Sunzi seems to see similarities between these formulations from Sunzi Bingfa, Weihu, Weihu, Shenhu, Shenhu, and you see the green somehow is in some ways similar, at least according to Sunzi. Maybe somebody in the audience can help me more with this. As for the content, of course, here, these are very similar indications. They are very Taological. They are a reminder that everything emerges from an inchoate beginning from where we should really start our assessment. So again, we're coming back to this as something that is not obvious and still not so obvious, and also a kind of a preventive focus where we should be looking there instead of waiting until it's too late. So it's suggesting that we pay attention to aspects of reality that we normally wouldn't, and it's also indicating a yin-yang kind of emphasis. And according to Thomas Michael, Köping D argues that the Dao De Jing is here in fact influenced by the Sunzi Bingfa, and he says this is, I suppose, Michael's translation: the perfection of the Dao De Jing's exquisitely mastered words and sentences, that have been transmitted through the ages is unequaled, yet its phrases and meanings are derived from the inspired writing of the Sunzi that allowed to transform to go beyond military affairs. And how could this be coincidental? Indeed. Now, I'm not going to take a stance on this issue of who was before whom, but I think these considerations show that there is no particularly good reason to assume that the Sunzi Bingfa is inspired or influenced by Dao De Jing rather than vice versa. Okay, so here we are. So what's the point of all this? And I think that's a really good question. Maybe we'll just leave that for the discussion. I have a few thoughts on comparisons such as this one, and we can talk about that. But just very briefly, the reason I'm interested in these writings is that I think they are relevant, and I think we can learn a lot from them. They have something to teach us about reality. They have something to tell us about our world, about our surroundings, about how to function as well as possible within these surroundings, about how to live a good life. And it seems to me that there is every reason to read the Dao De Jing and the Sunzi Bingfa together. They resonate in their underlying worldview, obviously, but also in the message they convey to the readers that we should approach things softly, delicately, and with as little enforced disturbance as possible. As for comparisons in general, of course, because there's a lot of discussion about what comparative philosophy is, I believe this is what we actually always do anyway. And incidentally, this is reflected quite clearly in the yin-yang Taoology, according to which there is no way for us to comprehend anything at all without comparing it with something we know. And in fact, David Hume also pointed this out. So I think philosophy is necessarily comparative philosophy, which perhaps makes the comparative classification redundant. Anyway, thank you very much for still being here after this long time.
Thank you very much, Geir, for this very interesting and exciting presentation. And we have time for discussion, for questions. So you can either type it in the chat or raise your hands.
Or comments. I would just be happy to have comments from people who know.
I already have a question from Halvor Eifring. Halvor, please.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and very inspiring. I agree, of course, very much with your approach to compare the two and to look at similarities and, of course, differences between the two. Yes. And you mentioned two possibilities in a way. One that Jing or Lao Tzu influenced Sunzi Bingfa, one that Sunzi Bingfa influenced Lao Tzu. Of course, there are other possibilities as well that both of them sort of take from a common way of looking at the world, of formulating concepts, etc. That is not one influencing the other at all. You can also argue very well that Mencius, or even to some extent the Lunyu, is influenced by the Dao De Jing, whether it was already present at the time or not, or the other way around. If you think of the work on Wu Wei that has been done, that where Wu Wei is, of course, very much present in the Dao De Jing, but also either explicitly or implicitly present in also many, including many so-called Confucian texts. So I think in a way it makes even more sense to see this as a kind of common material that they are picking from, a common way of speaking about things, about conceptualizing things that they are picking from, with slightly different sort of emphases in the different works. And but I learned a lot about Sunzi Bingfa during this presentation, so thanks a lot.
Thank you for your comment, and I completely agree with you. Of course, maybe the reason I focus so much on these two possibilities was that it seems for the most part to be assumed that Sunzi is influenced by Daoist insights, and maybe I just found that perhaps to be too one-sided. But of course, I mean, these are also oral texts that were in circulation, and perhaps many ideas that have also been circulating around, and it's really impossible to say that one influences the other. They are all somehow operating at the same time, you know. So maybe it makes no sense to say that one is really influencing the other. But I completely agree.
Okay, thank you very much. We have then Professor Paul. You can unmute yourself if you want and ask your question. Like, we cannot hear you at the moment. Yes, I see you now. Please.
Oh, nice to see you, Karl-Heinz. Been a while. You have to unmute your microphone.
We can hear you.
Not yet. Sign language.
I see Professor Paul is unmuted, but probably there is some problem with his microphone.
Oh. Karl-Heinz, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. There must be some issue with the microphone. You can write your question, and maybe you can write it in the chat.
We still can't hear you, unfortunately. Maybe you can type your question in the chat.
Or maybe he can try to leave and rejoin the call. Sometimes
Yeah.
It miraculously works.
Yeah. And we have another question in the meantime, and then we can come back to you once you have managed to come back. Okay. So we have a question by Lea Cantor.
Hi, thank you so much
Hi.
for this very interesting talk, and for the opportunity to ask questions. So my question is a bit off topic in a sense, but since you did mention the contemporary relevance of these texts and how they might be interpreted in a way that is relevant to current discussions, I thought I'd ask the question. So I'm coming from, essentially what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to think about why wartime German resistance would talk about Lao Tzu in kind of calling for people to resist the Nazi regime. So I'm looking at specifically the White Rose movement and in Germany, and they mention Lao Tzu. They quote Lao Tzu in the second pamphlet that they released in 1942. And the reason I mention this is chapter 58 is one of the two chapters that is mentioned, and it seems like they think that Lao Tzu is speaking to a message of passive resistance, which is obviously popular by definition, and it's kind of going against the ruler, in this case, Hitler. And they translate various terms so they use a German translation that dates to the 20s that is very political and makes it sound like Lao Tzu would have resisted someone like Hitler. And what I was wondering is, this kind of goes to the heart of a tension that I sometimes see in Lao Tzu, which is to do with whether this is a manual for a ruler, if we read him in a kind of, or read the text as a kind of military manual, as some do. Is it supposed to be about giving the people power in some sense, or is it more about a kind of manual for keeping power as a ruler? So definitely there are chapters that could speak to either of those tendencies, I think. And of course, Hanfei's reading of Lao Tzu would suggest a kind of approach where you kind of try to preserve the ruler's power. But of course, that's debated as well in Hanfei, what the ultimate agenda is. So yeah, I was wondering whether you think Wu Wei, as it relates to these kind of military strategies of kind of preventing war, preventing bloodshed, whether that can be kind of squared with a message of passive resistance, or whether you think that that's taking it a bit too far.
Wow, that's an outstanding question. That's really applying the Tao Te Ching in actual circumstances, right? Well, I haven't heard of this reference to the Tao Te Ching in this respect, but that's really interesting. Well, normally it's considered that the Tao Te Ching is a manual for rulers, so more addressed to rulers than to the common people. But then, of course, it addresses the overall situation, right? You know, so it's also a reminder of the ruler. If the ruler is not doing what the ruler is supposed to do, then that could be a very hairy situation for the ruler, because then the people are likely to resist in one way or another. So of course that's an indirect message to the common people when they start reading the book on their own. But I mean, there are also different views on you know who the book is written for, and I don't think it has been established beyond any doubt. You know, so. Yes, like I said in the beginning, it can be read from many different points of view. I mean, that's one of the strengths of the Tao Te Ching. In fact, I think it's one of the strengths of the Sunzi Bingfa as well. It can be read from many different points of view. Possibly it may have been for rulers, but it can also be read as a kind of a cultivation practice. Yangsheng, as I said, you know, how can you lead the best kind of life? I mean, it actually has a lot to offer on that as well. I would say the Sunzi Bingfa also has a lot to offer on how we deal with our reality, simply how we deal with things, you know. So we may have, okay, the focus is perhaps on the enemy, but the enemy doesn't have to be interpreted so narrowly. It can simply be the things that we are dealing with in every day, which are sometimes very complicated. I think, for instance, for how to raise children, you know, you could have a Sunzi Bingfa on raising children in a way, because how do you deal with children? Well, sometimes you need to trick them, you know, in order for them to do things, you know. But it's not bad, you know. You actually get a good kind of result with it. So obviously, the Tao Te Ching can be approached from the point of view of those who want to resist governments that are not doing their jobs. You know, that's quite possible. But I don't know about passive resistance. It could even be active resistance. Why Wu Wei could, I suppose Wu Wei could be thought of as active resistance, but normally Wu Wei would be understood as something you do with as little effort as possible. So kind of indirect method, perhaps. I mean, in fact, I think the Tao Te Ching would probably have, or the kind of sensibility you find in Tao Te Ching would probably have recommended that you have to make sure that a government such as the Nazi government is not capable of taking power. So you have to do it beforehand. You have to, you have to establish institutions that prevent this from happening. I mean, that's the easy way. When they are in government, you're in trouble. You know, I mean, that's when it becomes really difficult. It probably doesn't answer your question, but the focus is on ease, on easy, on doing things without having to sacrifice a lot or making a lot of effort or enforcing things. So that means that that's why I'm focusing so much on prevention, because you have to think ahead and ensure that you can actually deal with the situation before it actually develops.
Thank you very much.
Maybe they should rather have used Mengzi, because I mean he's much more sort of proactive in that sense, that and Sunzi, of course, speaking of the government as a boat and the common people as the ocean. The ocean can tipple the boat.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can go back to Professor Paul if we can. I think we still can't hear you, unfortunately.
Why don't you type your question, Karl-Heinz? Type it in the chat. And we'll just meditate. Oh. No.
Because you can find the chat box above the
at the top of your screen.
Yes, at the top of the screen there is the symbol of
like a bubble with some line in the middle. It's a round bubble with some lines, and if you click there, it should open. No, doesn't work. I'm really sorry for this. Everything was going so well so far. I'm sorry. Yeah. All right. Okay, are there any more questions or answers or comments? Anyone would like to add anything? Some follow-up questions maybe? Oh, Federico.
Yes.
Please.
Yes, I was curious to know Geir's impression, since he knows the text, I mean, pretty well, the Sunzi Bingpa, since he has translated it. What kind of description do you think we have of the decision-making process in the Sunzi Bingpa? Just to be more precise with my question, would you agree that in this kind of thought that we find in the Sunzi Bingpa, but also in the Lao Tzu, for example, the stress is more on detecting signals rather than making decisions based on general assumptions, on principles, on values, and so on? do you have the impression that this is what is important in the process of decision making, or is it just a cliche about this kind of tradition or strain of thought? I was curious to know your view about this issue.
I don't think it's a cliche. I think it's true. I think there is a very strong emphasis on alertness, on really evaluating the situation. In fact, chapter 1 really gives the tone. You know, I mean, it really basically says, you know, that the one who really prepares well is the one that will be victorious. And in fact, it really even seems to indicate that, you know, if one of the party is so well prepared that the other one will actually see that he doesn't stand a chance, then the victory has been won already. You know, so it's really about preparation. It's about evaluating the situation. It's about knowing your own strengths and weaknesses, and it's about I mean, that's the chapter 5. You know, it's really about, you know, understanding, you know, what sort of energy is involved in the situation. So I don't think it's a cliche at all. I think it really has to do with seizing opportunities, you know, when they present themselves. And in fact, I don't think this is restricted to Sunzi. I think, in fact, this is also very present in other schools of thought in China. It's a kind of a pragmatic element of things that we of course we have this underlying worldview, which is more or less shared by all the schools of thought, where things are constantly changing. And if you are not aware of the changes that are occurring in your environment and the changing configurations that are always taking place between you and the environment, other people, and so on, then it's going to be very difficult for you to deal with the situation. So it's really about alertness, and I think that's one of the reasons why, for instance, in the case of Confucianism, why it's so difficult to be a Confucian, because you always have to be so conscious about everything that's going on, and I think this is how most people have failed in a way. And if you look at the later books in the Lunye, which have been shown to be from a later period, you start getting lists of things, you know, how, you know, what is a good friend, you know, and then you have lists of all kinds of characteristics. This is laziness, you know, this is when you're not able anymore to evaluate the situation, and you have to have some kind of dogmas, you know. But this is definitely not what Confucius had in mind in the beginning. It's like, no, assess the situation all the time, you know, because it's always changing. It's very hard. I mean, I'm certainly not able to do it. I have to resort to dogmas.
Yeah, and also, if I may add just another thing, Lea Kantor mentioned the handmaids, of course, and this idea of the anonymous leaders is so similar to the empty ruler, the Xu ruler, according to the handmaid, right? So there is a very similar view, although in the case of the handmaid, it's really focused on the stage, on the functioning of the political sphere, but we have a similar understanding of what leadership is, I think, which is all connected, as you said, to the concept of that we also find elaborated in the so-called legalist school.
Maybe Hanfeizi takes it one step further in a way. I think. I mean, you have this Wu Wei ruler in the Tao Te Ching for sure, but whether it would align itself with the ruler in the Hanfeizi, I mean, it's definitely related kind of idea. So Hanfeizi and the legalists would like to see a kind of a system, you know, where you just basically set everything up, and then you have the handles, of course, and you have you know, punishment and rewards, and basically if people all behave according to those things, then everything will work very smoothly. So that it will be a kind of a Wu Wei in that sense. But it's also a kind of an attempt to maybe establish something on a very simple basis in a way. I suppose.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Since I temporarily see no, okay, Professor Paul, shall we try again, please? We can't see you yet.
Now we can't even see him.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, it's coming.
Coming back.
All right.
And still
We
not
still
audible.
can't hear you. I'm sorry, this is so frustrating. We're really sorry for this.
Maybe if I, can we write? Let me see.
The chat is only available to team members, so he can't even write in the chat.
Ah, okay. Yeah. I see. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, this is something new that the chat is
it should
available to team members. Generally, it was open to everybody.
Yeah, it's not open to me either.
Okay, let's show.
Well, okay, that's no big deal.
I'm really sorry for this. I don't see other options to unmute. I think there's a problem with the microphone somehow, really.
Yeah, it happens.
Yeah. Sure. So are there any other urgent questions? Otherwise, I will slip in my own question in the meantime, maybe. And yeah, thank you so much. And while you were talking, I'm not very familiar with the Sunzi, I have to say, but I, of course, was thinking about these arguments, about this idea that the person really wins, the one who really wins is the one who doesn't even have to initiate a conflict. So I was thinking, of course, about the chapters against war in the Mozi, and I was thinking if you have found any interesting points of contact from the linguistic or semantic point of view, or from, because I see, of course, the model has a strong moral component that might not necessarily be there, but I was wondering if you have had any chance to look at this text within this context as well.
Well, I'm sorry to say, but I haven't even checked. So I'm not even going to try to answer that question with
okay.
one comment. I'm sorry, but if you think it's worth checking, then I will definitely do that. Yeah.
I think from the conceptual point of view, it would be interesting to see how, because the idea is also there. It's against war, but we know that the Mois actually allow, especially just war, or from the point of view of defensive war, more than finding strategic ways to attack. Yes, but of course, always starting from the idea you're not the first to initiate the conflict. So there's also strong stress on the idea that you should really find strategic ways to avoid conflict in the first place. So it might be interesting to look at different perspective of addressing the same kind of problem or proposing the same kind of strategy, but of course from a different perspective, which is really the one that we should avoid war, because war is in any case seen negatively. So there is in any way a moral assessment of war that comes into the discourse that might not have such a strong focus in military text, for instance, but might be interesting to integrate that as well, maybe in the discourse.
Well, I mean, I would say that there is a very strong anti-war stance in the Sunzi Bingfa. The Sunzi Bingfa is really a work on peace rather than on war. You know, how to bring about peace. You know, it's not really about warfare as such. It's really about how to prevent warfare. Yeah. But then when you have warfare and you can't avoid it, then how to minimize the damage, you know. So it's really about that. I think the Tao Te Ching, to the extent that we have a few passages on war, and I think they are very similar in tone to the Sunzi Bingfa. And then we have the Zhuangzi, and that's a little bit different, because then you have passages that actually seem to justify uprisings. You know, maybe that speaks to what's her name, Leah, who came before and asked about Zhuangzi actually justifies war against evil rulers. You know, it's perfectly justified. You know, to have a violent conflict against an evil ruler, and you don't really have that so much in the Tao Te Ching. It seems to be much more focused on, you know, preserve peace, you know, at all costs.
Yeah,
Which is maybe, I mean, I wonder now. I'm just thinking aloud, but if this is a kind of a value that has been somehow preserved, has been preserved in Chinese culture in a way. This sort of preventive way, I think sometimes maybe there is a tendency to go really far in prevention in order to avoid any kind of chaos, avoid any kind of disturbance, you know. So you will go really far, you know, to prevent this from happening, and even a kind of a legalist, take some legalist measures, you know, to make sure that this will not happen. And perhaps that can explain some of the measures taken by the present government of China sometimes. I don't know, but that's more like a speculation.
Yeah, but we all know that how actual these ancient theories turn out to be in contemporary also political discourse. So they're always there lingering in the background, and they're always still very actual and effective, even if applied to present times. So
I think definitely the value, like this emphasis on this value is definitely there. And what we see, of course, if we take the warring states schools, I mean, that's most of the Chinese philosophical schools actually emerged during the warring states, and they're all dealing with the same issue. I mean, how can we bring order, which is very different from the Western philosophical schools, which didn't. I mean, the pre-Socratics, they were not really dealing with these problems. They were actually they came into existence in times of prosperity, and they could allow themselves to speculate about all kinds of things, you know, not dealing so much with political issues. But all the Chinese schools had to deal with political issues indirectly or directly. And so it's not unlikely that this heavy-handed focus on, you know, avoiding chaos has been sort of present throughout the entire history of the Chinese imperial system, up to the present day. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So I see no more questions. Anyone wants to make one last comment? We still have time maybe for one more question or comment.
One more question from Karl-Heinz Pohl.
If it does work, we're absolutely happy to have one more.
Karl-Heinz, write me an email.
Yeah,
we can meet on Skype or something.
Yeah, I really apologize for that. Everything was working perfectly today, too perfect. It was too good to be true. All right, so if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank you, Geir, once again for accepting the invitation, giving this wonderful talk. And I will leave the floor to Federico, who will announce the next conversation.
Well, maybe Chiara wants to announce it.
Yeah, any of us.
Okay.
Really. This gives me a chance to say how much I appreciated this talk. And well, apart from focusing on a dead state cannot be brought back to life, but I was also reasoning on what the legacy actually Sunzi art of warfare had in Japan, and also in especially maybe in Muromachi Japan, which was not a peaceful period in Japanese history. But I guess there it was more a question of strategies of effectiveness and also all the discourse on deception. I know that Sunzi has been translated a lot in Japanese, but I think that the Geir's viewpoint is actually quite new, even within Japanese studies. So I really appreciated it. And while I really thank him for this talk, I will announce next and actually last, at least for this semester, conversation on the 7th of May at 11:30 Central European Time. And Professor Yuri Pines from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem will talk about social engineering in the book of Lord Shang. So we are very much looking forward to his talk, and we invite you all to participate. So I thank everyone once again, and see you in May.
Thank you.
Thank you.